Good evening, and thank you all for coming out. Just a couple of quick reflections in the beginning. We talked about China and the ultimate impact of this. I'm going to outline the impacts on your life potentially. My wife and her family are from China. And the impacts there are much more devastating, unimaginably more devastating than here. You know, we have an air quality standard that says when it gets to 100, you go inside and lay down, you know. And routinely in Shenzhen and Hong Kong, the air index can get to 300. And recently in Beijing, it went past 700 to 900. There are impacts. It's a huge natural experiment to see what happens. It's one of the saddest things I know. And the very sad thing to me is those are my relatives. That's my family. So I hope that we can do something about it here to prevent it just in a fairly self-interested way because they're my family and my people. But really, I mean, we're in church. We're all one people. We have to look out for each other. If we don't, the people that are greedy, the people that are selfish, will have an impact on all the rest of us. Briefly, 2 years ago, a young doctor in my community who was very smart and very widely respected, Sarah Mostad, sent an email out to the other doctors in the community. She says, I've heard about this cohort thing and it really makes me nervous and I'm worried. Sarah has, she's an MD from Harvard and a PhD in epidemiology as well, and she's the person in our community that if your child is critically ill, she's the one that I want to take care of my son. So when she said that, about a dozen of us showed up. Docs are busy people and not inclined to get involved in politics, certainly not controversial politics. But as we began to look at things, we said, okay, let's talk science, because the people that showed up, some were Republicans and some were Democrats, and some were progressive and some were conservative, and some were related to business people, some were related to progressive causes, but a very diverse group. And that was one of our most important strengths, was that nobody could get away with anything, because the other people would hold you accountable. And as we went through, what we did, we said, let's look at the science. We're scientists. And so we did a literature review of coal and its transportation and what the health impacts might be. We reviewed 400 articles. Now, all of us have full-time jobs, so when did we do it? We did it between 9 at night and 1 in the morning. Our group now has grown to over 215 physicians. And every time we make a statement, we make it as a group, and anybody that wants to opt out can opt out of it. We have yet to have one person of those 215 opt out on anything we've done. And that's because we looked at the science. Now, when we looked at articles, we didn't look at articles in popular magazines. We looked at articles in scientifically refereed journals, journals that looked critically at each article. If it wasn't published in a refereed, science-based journal, we didn't even look at it. As we looked through those 400 articles, about 5 or 6 different topics emerged as critically important to people's health. And we became very concerned about those health issues. We know, for example, that diesel particulate matter, the stuff that comes out of the trains and the ships that transport this stuff, that may actually be the biggest single health concern. In our community, we already know that what they're planning is to move 50 million tons of coal through our community to Cherry Point. To do that, they have to have a train that's 1.6 miles long every day, every hour of the year. That what you envision as the worst possible scenario is what we already plan on getting. If it passes and it goes into operation, it'll be a 1.6 mile long train every hour of every day, every year. And the impact of that, these trains, one engine doesn't pull them. It requires 6 locomotives, 3 in the front and 3 in the back. And the amount of pollution that's generated by that is the equivalent of building a brand new freeway in our community. And when we looked at the impacts of diesel particulate matter, I'm going to talk more about that in detail, but we found very concerning information about that. The second thing we looked at was coal dust. Coal dust is a very common issue. The speaker before me disturbed me a great deal because The worst thing that happens to coal is, because it actually doesn't go very far, it'll go about 5 kilometers. But when it becomes soluble, when it gets in little particles and gets into the ocean, so it has mercury and cadmium and lead and other things in it that then become part of the biological food chain. In fact, one of the biggest concerns is actually for the herring, and my colleague James is going to talk about that later. But literally, it can get into the ocean, and simply the biomat that it creates, the biological barrier that's created, prevents the light from getting to the eelgrass on the bottom of the bay, kills the eelgrass, which kills the herring, which provide the food for the salmon, which provide the food for the orcas. So coal dust in and of itself is concerning both for personal health but also for environmental reasons. The other critical issues, I think, are that are safety, primarily. We've already had one case where the doctor actually was able to get to the hospital and the patient got to the hospital, but the technician that ran the heart-lung machine was delayed 20 minutes by a train. Now that's with 3 trains a day going back and forth. When it becomes a train every hour, and these trains are going to be much longer than the current ones, those delays can be significant for the ambulance, for the police, for the fire. And as those responses become delayed, there will be consequences. The other consequence is one that unfortunately you've experienced recently. 2 years ago, we had a young mother struck by a train in the middle of Bellingham. 2 weeks ago, you had that happen here. Something I said casually in a debate, a public debate with some opponents, was I said, people will die as a result of what you want to do. And they went ballistic. They said, that's not true, that can't be. I can tell you that it is true and that it will be. We don't know how many. We don't know what ages or what genders. There's a lot we don't know. But I can tell you unequivocally that people will die. And they will be somebody's grandmother. They will be somebody's wife. They will be somebody's children. And what's it worth? What is all that money worth? Help, James.
Point it right.
What did I do?
Point it right.
Oh, this way?
Yeah, point it at the top.
Oh, there it is. So when you're talking about the ships, just to give you some idea, and this is something that shocked me. These ships, the trains, well, pardon me, the trains, as you can see, 1.6 miles long, that's the train, all the way around there. They're massive. I talked about them already. The ships, the Panamax ships are the largest ones that can go through the Panama Canal. They're the second biggest ship. The bigger ships are the Cape-class ships. They're the largest moving things that human beings have ever made, ever. And they're designed not just to go to China, but to go to India. They have several million tons, several million gallons of fuel inside of them. They're single-hull vessels, and they have the worst safety record of any vessel. That's what we're letting loose in the Salish Sea. More than one a day, 400 ships a year, just for the port that's proposed in Bellingham. This is the route. You can see it goes from the Powder River Basin through Montana, through Idaho. The impact of this and other projects will have over 200 trains going through this point right here, which branches off to several other places. It then comes down along the Columbia River and back up to the proposed site at Cherry Point, or to West Shore, or to the Fraser River docks. They're all, that's the ultimate location. As I said, 18 or more 1.6 mile long trains, 400 very large ships, 48 million tons. Now, one of the things that our physician group did, we like to think of ourselves as moral people. 2 years ago, we all sat down at a table and we said, we don't want to just push this out of our community. We're not going to do that. We're going to be shoulder to shoulder with every other community along this line. Within 2 weeks, I got an invitation to go and speak in Montana, where this stuff starts, to the first city that's going to be impacted by it, and I went. And I'm here now. This, I think, is my 3rd or 4th trip here. We made a commitment not just to shove it out of our community and into another community. And I want you to make that same pledge, that you won't just push it out of your community into other communities. We have to speak truth to power on this one. We have to say no and mean it. The health issues I briefly alluded to earlier, the coal dust, diesel exhaust, noise pollution, delays at rail crossings, and safety of trains and ships. The one that I skipped, right, is noise pollution. And it's the one that when all of us docs were sitting down, I looked at the Dr. Rosette and I said, you gotta be kidding. Noise, nah, not a real issue. But because we were being scientists, he brought his articles and laid them down on the table, and I had to read them. And you know what? Noise is a major issue. For elders in particular, they can't sleep all night. And when you can't sleep all night, you know what happens? Cardiac arrhythmias go up and people die more often. What does it do to kids that are trying to study or trying to sleep at night? It impairs their cognitive, intellectual development from the beginning. And should it be that you would get what we don't get, and you do have a train every hour that's 1.6 miles long, you will find that that will definitely disturb lots of people's sleep all night long. The primary organ systems, I'm going to basically quickly go over two different approaches. One is to talk about the organ system damage, and then to go through the particular kinds of environmental causes that will create those things. But basically they are respiratory, circulatory, and neurological. This is a summary slide. Behind this slide are reviewing 400 articles. If you don't believe what I say, that's fine. We have put our summaries of most of those articles online at coltraneFacts.org, and you can go look at the article, you can get the reference, you can read it yourself and independently evaluate it. We, as a very heterogeneous group, looked at all these articles and we independently evaluated them. And what we concluded was that the respiratory and oxidative stress response increases asthma. Excuse me. Increases asthma exacerbations, increases the development of asthma, causes chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, same thing you get from smoking, stunts lung development in children, increases infant mortality, and increases lung cancer. There are scientific medical articles that prove all those things happen. The cardiovascular effects, there's science that says there's an increased rate of coronary heart disease, from arrhythmias, from heart attacks, from congestive heart failure. In terms of the nervous system, there are increased risk of ischemic strokes. That's the kind that are caused by a blood clot rather than a bleed. Cerebrovascular disease and loss of intellectual capacity. The disturbing thing, as a public health physician myself and as a professor, what you want to know is not just that it happens, but who does it happen to? And what we know is the most vulnerable people are who it happens to. And who are the most vulnerable people? Children, the elderly, people with pre-existing lung disease, people with pre-existing heart disease, diabetics. Women over 50 are particularly vulnerable to these impacts. And workers, of course, are exposed both to the coal dust and to the diesel particulate matter from the combustion of diesel. One of my colleagues, Stephen Gilbert, who's you can't read it very well, but he's a neurotoxicologist from the University of Washington. He makes a great point of saying that children are not just short adults. The reality is that they eat more, they breathe more, they drink more per body weight than adults do, and the impact of the health-related exposures are greater on them than on adults. So that was one way to look at it by organ system. And again, you're welcome to come and look at the medical literature. To look at it by the cause of those things, so what are the things that bring those changes about? Coal dust is one of them. Coal dust, there is scientific literature that shows it's associated with chronic bronchitis, with emphysema, and with pulmonary fibrosis. Coal spills, this is a specific example that recently occurred in Washington State where they, on July 2nd, a coal train derailed in east of Washington, 31 cars went over and 6 million pounds of coal hit the ground. We still know how to clean up. When you mention the trestle that's in bad repair, there was a trestle where a coal train went off and struck a car on the road below it, killing several people. These are things that really happen. These aren't theories. This is what happens. Environmental contamination, according to Burlington Northern Santa Fe, it's interesting that many of the proponents for this deny this, but it's Burlington Northern Santa Fe's own data that they released, that 500 pounds of coal comes off each car on each trip. And the big problem they have is that it accumulates to such an extent that the trains derail because there's so much coal, they don't fit in the slots anymore. And mercury, lead, cadmium, the things I mentioned earlier, are in coal, and when they get on the ground, that can be leached into the water. Now, diesel particulate matter, from a strictly health point of view, is the most concerning aspect of this. It's not, coal dust is bad, this stuff is horrible. So diesel particulate matter, basically, they're small enough, it comes in a size 2.5 microns, and 2.5 microns is just a number, right? But what that means is it's a small enough particle that it can go into your lungs, down your bronchioles, all the way to your alveoli. In other words, right to that smallest air sac in your lung, and that particle can come in contact with your capillaries and transmit what it's got into your bloodstream. That's what makes it a very bad kind of particle. There's basically, once you combust diesel, there's a carbon core. Around that carbon core, there are organic compounds, there are sulfate nitrates, there's metals, and there's other toxic substances that all form that 2.5 micron size particle. So it takes the worst things from combustion around that tiny carbon core in a size that is respirable down to the deepest part of your lung, next to your capillaries, and transported into your bloodstream. Now, diesel particulate matter comes from all kinds of places, but just so you know, no truck built in the United States in the past 2 years has produced any particulate matter at all. There's technology available to prevent it. The locomotives had political power and sway with our government, and they were exempted from those laws. These fine particulate pollution cause increase in cardiovascular disease, increase in lung cancer, increased hospitalizations for asthma in children, decreased lung development in children. There was a review both by the American Lung Association and the American Heart Association. Both independently came to these same conclusions. A study in 2010 by the Puget Sound Clean Air Agency and the University of Washington showed that diesel emissions remain the largest contributor to potential cancer risk in the Puget Sound area. As a baseline, in the Puget Sound area, again, in our part of the world, that costs $190 million a year, the baseline, before you add all this pollution to it. So they brag about $10 or $15 million in tax revenue. We are subsidizing them dramatically. We are paying in our insurance premiums and in our medical bills far more than what they're going to get in taxes. This is the site where a young mother in our community was killed, where the train hit her. But it illustrates the point that, you know, there's going to be delays. The police, the fire, the ambulance cannot get through. They will be delayed. It also illustrates the fact that these trains, if they lock up all the brakes on a 1.6 mile long train, it takes 1 mile for them to stop. They can't stop. Noise exposure, as I briefly mentioned earlier, regular noise exposure of the kind we're talking about, basically cardiovascular disease goes up, increases in blood pressure, arrhythmias, stroke, ischemic heart disease, cognitive impairment in children, sleep disturbance, and exacerbation of mental disorders such as depression and anxiety are routine. That's what you can plan on. That's what you can expect. What we have called for is a health impact assessment, and that means that scientists will take the data from these kinds of articles and apply them to a particular population. So we just don't know that bad things can happen. You can do the modeling, and the science will tell you how many elders, are going to have the sleep disturbance and how many are going to have the cardiac arrhythmias because of it. They're going to tell you how many children are going to develop asthma that otherwise would not have had asthma. They can tell you how many children are going to be hospitalized because of that asthma. Now, I have asthma. It's like breathing through a straw, and you get sicker and sicker and shorter of breath. Now, I was unfortunate enough last year, right about this time, to be hospitalized with not only asthma, but pneumonia and sepsis and septic shock. I watched my blood pressure go from 120 to 0 and saw everybody in the room running towards me to stick a needle in here and a line inside my heart while I was awake. That's what asthma means. It's a real deal. $35,000 that cost me. Those are the kinds of impacts that seem theoretical, and they're not theoretical. That happened to me last year from my asthma. And we can expect to see it happen. Basically, asthma rates in kids where there are cold terminals versus where they're not. We've looked at that on the east coast of the United States. Asthma rates in kids are twice as high. Double. One other thing I'll just mention is that we give this stuff to China, but one of the things we don't realize, and there's several studies on this, when China burns it, it goes up in the atmosphere, and it's sort of ironic. Where does it go, do you think? It comes back here. Between 15 and 30% of the mercury that's depositions on the surface of the ground here comes from Chinese coal power plants. Now, you may think that that's theoretical. The water supply I drink in Bellingham comes from Lake Whatcom. Lake Whatcom has so much mercury in it that the fish in it cannot be eaten by children or pregnant women already. A health impact assessment is what's needed. It needs to be independent, it needs to be objective, it needs to be dispassionate and fair. It needs to be fair to the proponents, but it needs to respect science. Now, we reached out to your provincial health officers starting 2 years ago, and they have been very responsive, and they have slowly and methodically proceeded. They have called for a health impact assessment as well at the provincial level, and both of the health officers in this area have also called for health impact assessment, an objective, fair health impact assessment, which means they take these concerns and they apply it to this population. Because the thing that these proponents can't stand to hear is that specific people, that children will suffer, that elders will suffer, that people with diabetes will suffer, that women over 50 will suffer. That's very difficult for them to deal with. It's hard for them to say. They can say jobs versus the environment all day long. What they can't say is that your suffering of your family, your mother, your children, your wife, your husband, they can't. What would you give up for that? How much money would it take? There isn't enough money. Not for my child, not for my wife. And that's the bottom line. So I think that we've looked at this, we've looked at it carefully, and what we know is there are significant and substantial health impacts that need to be included into the math around jobs, into the math around profitability. And we believe that if we don't even need to think about climate change in China, we can just look at our own, and we'll realize that when we do the math, that the costs far outweigh the benefits. Now, let me say one disturbing thing about politics, and that was I was invited to come and speak, and I spoke in the city of Vancouver. And as you may know, they recently rezoned the entire city coal port free. That's a few weeks ago. At the end of that, everybody that spoke was against coal ports and coal trains. One person was not, and he was a member of parliament that came from the coal-producing regions of British Columbia. And the most interesting exchange I saw was he said when they were ready to vote for it, he knew he was going to lose. It passed 9-2, rezoning the entire city. He said, "You're not going to get away with this. The federal government's going to make you take coal ports." You know, that might work as a threat, but honestly, I believe that when citizens like yourself really understand the implications, the federal people can be replaced too.